One of the biggest problems you have learning jazz is that practicing arpeggios as exercises doesn't help you use them in solos. If you just play exercises and start improvising, it's almost a waste of time. But there's another way to approach this, and it's a lot easier than you might think. You can compare jazz to cooking. Arpeggios are one ingredient, but it doesn't work if it's the only one, and you need to learn how to combine ingredients. Going through this approach, I'm sure you're gonna find options that you've never tried before, but let me know about that along the way in the comments. Exploring this exercise is a bit like using counterpoint rules, but also not really. We need an arpeggio to start with, so to keep it easy, take this C major 7 in the most simple form. As you can see, I only use a 1-octave arpeggio and not a full position like this one. Arpeggio positions are good for some things, but if you look at jazz solos, then 90% of the arpeggios used are just the root position and also just the 1-octave version. So it's not a big problem if you start with that, and then you can explore the rest later using the same principles if you want to. That's just gonna make it a lot easier. Sometimes you think of an arpeggio as a set of notes or intervals like root, third, fifth and seventh, but instead it can be useful to think of it as a melody. In fact, a melody with 2 variations, ascending and descending. Of course, you could make more permutations, but these are the easiest to use and that's the most practical place to start. Let's start with the ascending arpeggio. How you want to think about this is similar to counterpoint, where the arpeggio is like a leap in one direction that you need to resolve by moving in the opposite direction. The first simple recipe is similar to a very common scale exercise. Arpeggio up, scale down. As you can hear, I'm not sticking to the scale down too strictly, and you don't have to do that either. That rarely sounds great. Go with what you can get to sound good. That's the goal. In this case, it might look like I'm using a C major triad at the end. But the way I think about it is as a Barry Harris half step. Barry's method is that when you don't have a chromatic note in between 2 notes, so in this case F and E, then you can use the scale note above, and that's the G. So that gives you... Now I'm not going to go into too much detail. I'll link to a video on this method in the description, and that really explains this. You'll see me add chromatic phrases and similar things all the time, since that's also a part of how jazz sounds. With this example, it's a bit tricky to add a chromatic note immediately after the arpeggio, but it is possible. 2 things about this example. Notice that you again have that half step between F and E. But now it's moved, so the half step, the G, is in fact coming out on beat 1. Now, whether you like to have that chromatic leading note, so the B flat, come out on beat 3, that's a question of taste, but I actually find it stronger to have a leading note that resolves up instead of down in this case. And that gives you this, but let me know what you think. There are of course many more options for using ascending arpeggios, but before we look at those, let's first explore the descending arpeggio melody, because that can be used in a way that actually doesn't work for the ascending version. It almost shouldn't work. Remember that I'm just showing you one example of an arpeggio. Of course, you should work on composing your own variations, combine them with the rest of your vocabulary, and in that way learn to use the arpeggios as each of these different melodies. But it is the best to take them one at a time. That will help you build your vocabulary and your skills a lot faster. Doing everything at once is rarely a good strategy. Chances are that you're not using descending arpeggios as much, and they are actually less common if you transcribe a lot of solos, but it is a beautiful sound, especially the second recipe, but the basic version is also great. And of course you can start here and then later make lines that are more complicated, like this. But you have 2 more ways to use descending arpeggios. The first one I think is the most exciting. Imagine that you have a scale run like this. Then you can insert the arpeggio, play it and continue down the scale. It's almost like taking a break from your scale run, and it really sounds great. As you can see, this doesn't follow counterpoint guidelines, but it's great for jazz solos and certainly worth exploring. All of these examples have the arpeggio as 8th notes, but before you start changing the rhythm of the arpeggio, check out this final descending example, cascading arpeggios. You can do this once in a while and it does work, but it mostly just sounds great at higher tempos because it's flashy and very active. You can move the arpeggios stepwise in the scale, like this example using E minor 7, D minor 7 and C major 7 arpeggios. But you can also experiment with using arpeggios in third distance. Here it's E minor 7, C major 7 and A minor 7 because that would all work over a C major 7 chord. Let's change the rhythm a bit to get some more options. The most common rhythmic variation for arpeggios is to play the arpeggio as a triplet with a leading note. We often refer to this as the bebop arpeggio. Now usually it's a chromatic leading note, but for C major 7, this is a B, which is also a scale note. As an example of a real chromatic note, then you can also look at the arpeggio of E minor 7, and here you would get a D sharp as a leading note. The basic version sounds like this, and I'm again combining it with a scale run and that Barry Harris half step. Clearly this works, and one change that makes it great for jazz is that the top note, the B, is now on the downbeat, which makes it a lot easier to add chromatic notes right after the arpeggio. This next line is something you will hear Charlie Parker do again and again, and it's also a favorite of George Benson. Let's look at another way to turn the arpeggio into a triplet. You can also create a triplet without a leading note, and this gives you a natural way to frame the note under the 7th, which sounds like this. And I'm sure you can hear how that really leads us to that A, making that a target note. This becomes a great line like this. How many of these do you already know, or are you getting a lot of new options? Let me know in the comments. Next, let's take a look at descending triplet arpeggios. You can get most of the same things to work for the descending triplet arpeggios. So start by adding a leading note in front of it. And here it becomes a real chromatic note, which is A sharp leading into the B. That sounds like this. The other triplet variation without the leading note also sounds great. Here I'm mixing it up with an enclosure of E that you probably heard before. And using a descending triplet as an interruption in a scale run also sounds great, even if the note right before the arpeggio is in fact the root of the arpeggio. You already saw one example of leading into the arpeggio with the chromatic leading note before the triplet arpeggio. But of course, you also have a lot of great options here. Different things will work for different arpeggios, so explore things and see what you like. Here are some of my favorites. Enclosures work well with arpeggios because an enclosure ending in a chord tone is usually a very strong melody. And check out how great this sounds with a descending arpeggio as well. Another thing I think you want to explore is combining arpeggios, like using an E minor 7 arpeggio to lead into a C major 7 arpeggio. But to really come up with great lines with the arpeggios, you need to find the other ingredients that you can use, and chromatic phrases are a huge part of that, as you already saw in my examples. The best place to check this out is definitely Barry Harris, and this video shows you how to use his system for adding half steps, and that is by far the most powerful system for this. It's instant bebop with great phrasing. Check it out. Learn jazz, make music.